You see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
First thing I want to say is today is Veterans Day. Thank all our veterans very much for their service. We honor you every day, but this is the one day that we kind of elevated a little bit and honor all you veterans that have served from World War II in the back there through Vietnam and every war since then. Thank you for your service. Yeah, give yourselves a hand. I was watching the news this morning and I didn't realize this statistic. 1% of this nation are the people that stand up and put their lives on the line for the rest of us. 1%. That's pretty low. So we owe you veterans a real debt. Thank you. Excited to have this next gentleman. He is the sheriff of Beaver County. He's spent 25 years as a Pennsylvania state trooper. During that time, he spent about 10 years administering polygraph tests, and I hope he'll tell us some pretty good stories of some of the things he's run across. He's going to also kind of update us on some things of current value, which is the fentanyl and opioid problem that we've got coming across our southern border particularly. He's been the Beaver County Sheriff for 7 years now. He's 3 years into his second term. So I'll let him tell you more about himself and what he's been up to and so forth. So without further ado, Sheriff Tony Guy.
Not used to, everybody hear me okay? I'm not used to wearing this thing, but thanks for having me here. Love the fact that you guys opened this up with the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner, and I always try to put myself when the Star-Spangled Banner is played. I try to put myself in the mind of Francis Scott Key at Fort McHenry, or looking at Fort McHenry, and it kind of brings the solemnity of what that song really means. Him looking at that flag and understanding that the fact that that flag was still standing and still flying meant that we still had a nation. That's good stuff to me. And I thought about hitting the button on this microphone thing during the national anthem, and so you guys could hear me sing a little bit better. And then I thought, no, that would take away a little bit from that solemnity. But Mark, thanks for acknowledging and recognizing our World War II veterans. I'm not a veteran myself, or I'm sorry, all of our veterans. I'm not a veteran myself, but I am a big supporter of veterans and veteran causes. And as a matter of fact, Mark and I talked on the phone about this a little bit. I've been to Normandy 4 times for the D-Day celebration over in France. And we, friends and I, travel across Europe and go to all World War II sites and spend a week to 12 days over there doing that. We've done that 4 times. So thank you, veterans. And again, like Mark said, 1%. times are getting tough, and the military's having a hard time recruiting people for various reasons. We deal with that. We're having trouble in law enforcement these days too, and I think it's the same mindset that is affecting people who have that written on their heart and have that calling to enter into that type of service, or being pushed away from it or drawn away from it for different reasons. So if you know people that are might have that, young people who might have that calling, please encourage them to seek that out and to follow through with that. But that's not why I'm here today. So I'm not used to this thing completely yet. So let me introduce myself a little bit. I got a lot of time to fill up, what seems like a lot of time to me. And so let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll kind of focus on, like Mark said, about some polygraph experiences, and people have a lot of questions about polygraph and how it works and things, but we'll get into that a little bit and maybe touch on some current issues, and then I'm really open to questions from you guys, because I don't want this to be so much about what I want to deliver to you as much as it needs to be about what maybe I can give you some information about. So my name is Tony Guy. I've been the sheriff in Beaver County for 7 years. Prior to that, I was a Pennsylvania State Trooper for 25, and I had a pretty good career with the state police. I started out at the busiest station in the state at that time, which was Uniontown, Fayette County, and it was a good place to learn a job. A lot of people look at the state police and think that they're highway patrol. Well, that's not the case in Pennsylvania. We do everything. From my first week on the job, I was going to homicides and bank robberies and domestics and bar fights and anything you can think of, and really got a lot of good experience in Uniontown. After about 3 years, I transferred to Newcastle, worked at another pretty good busy station, and then I started doing some various different things in my career. So for a few years, I rode a motorcycle on a parkway, transferred down here to the Pittsburgh station and rode a motorcycle on a parkway. And then I worked undercover out of the Washington barracks for about 2.5, 3 years, mainly buying drugs. That's what I did there, and arresting people who sold those drugs. At that point, again, I wanted to change what I was doing. The state police has a SWAT team. It's called CERT, Special Emergency Response Team. So I tried out for that. And everything I did in my career with the state police, it was a matter of proving yourself through testing and interview processes and looking at what you had done at your previous job to be able to be selected for these positions. So I was selected for the CERT team, and did that for actually the last 15 years of my career. But in the state police, that's a part-time position. So I had my normal everyday run-of-the-mill Monday through Friday or 40 hours a week job with the state police, and then a couple of days a month we would train, and we would also go to activations. And so we got pretty busy towards the end of my career. We were getting activated about 70 times a year to go and address situations like barricaded gunmen, high-risk warrants, executive protection type details, large-scale protests, things like that. And so I got to see a lot of different things and experience a lot of different things. Once I got on CERT, as I was continuing to do my regular job, which was patrol at that time, an opening came up for a polygraph examiner. And so I thought that would be interesting. Frankly, to be honest with you, I was married at that time, had a young child, and I thought this was going to be a little bit of stability in my life too, because generally it's a Monday through Friday job. You're helping investigators out with their investigations for the most part. And so, again, we went through a selection process and was picked for that. And the polygraph school that the state police sent me to was up in Canada. It was at the Royal Canadian Police College, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canadian Police College in Ottawa, Canada, and it's a 13-week training. And during that training, they teach you a lot of really, think about going to a school 40 hours a week for 13 weeks just to learn how to operate this instrument, but it's a whole lot more than that. And so let me finish up a little bit on my career, and then I'll jump back to that. So I was able to get promoted as a polygraph examiner, and in around 2010, I got promoted a second time to sergeant, went out to the eastern part of the state, came back, worked in Uniontown again for a little while. My last job with the state police was as a criminal investigation supervisor, a sergeant in Washington, PA, and I oversaw the criminal investigation unit that included all of Troop B, 5 counties in southwestern Pennsylvania. But back to polygraph. So it's been a long time since I've done this, since I've given this presentation. I used to do it quite a bit, and I used to bring my polygraph instrument with me and actually do a physical demonstration, show people how it worked. I no longer have one of those. It belongs to you, the taxpayer, so I had to give it back to the state police when I retired. And let me say this too. So when I retired in 2010, I took a little bit of time off, and then I worked some private security details. And then I recognized some things that were in need of some change in Beaver County, particularly in the sheriff's office. And so prayed about it a lot and talked to my wife and my family about it and jumped into the political process that is necessary to become a sheriff. And so I got elected as a Republican in Beaver County, a county that was about 60% Democrat at that time. And I think in large part one of the things that helped to get me elected is my background and my experience that people recognized and saw that might be good for the sheriff's office. So I ran for a second election in 2019, and I'll be up again for re-election next year. I'm 61 years old. I don't know how long I'm going to be doing this. Looking around the room, I don't think 61's old, guys, do you? So I'll hopefully, God willing, I'll do this at least another 4 years or another 5 years at this point, and we'll see where things go after that. But polygraph. Everybody's probably seen polygraph tests on TV, whether it's in a movie or on some documentary or there used to be a show, I think, on TV too, where a guy would give a polygraph test and ask these people these questions. And I think some of the talk shows used to do it too. But basically the way a polygraph test works is when a person is put in a situation where if they get caught, if the person that they're speaking with knows that they have done something wrong, something that could embarrass them, something that could get them in trouble, something that could land them in jail, there are certain physiological reactions that take place in the body that are beyond your control. And so what the polygraph instrument allows us to do is monitor those physiological reactions that are taking place. So there's 3 ways that we do that. Number 1, we measure the sweat on your fingertips. So when you're nervous, you ever get sweaty palms, sweaty hands? Well, that occurs in your fingertips too. So we put metal sensors on your fingers that measures the conductivity of the electricity running through there. It's not something that you would feel, but there was a very low voltage electricity that goes through there, and that comes up on the computer screen. And let me say this too: the old type of polygraph instrument was a big box, and it had paper running through it, and had these little needles on it that drew squiggly lines. Well, everything's computerized these days, so those wires from those sensors on your fingers go through that transfer box and into a computer through a USB port, and it comes up on a computer screen, and it can be saved and actually printed out on pieces of paper. But it comes up looking exactly like the old polygraph instrument looked like. The second thing that we monitor is breathing, right? So we put what we call pneumotubes across a person's chest. So one just below the chest, one on the top of the chest. And when you think about nervous situations, your breathing is affected by that. And again, you can control your breathing if you want to, but there are normal breathing patterns that we look for and we see things that are different than those normal breathing patterns come out of that. And that's what allows us to make evaluations and judge a person's veracity when we're asking them questions. The third thing that we do is we put a blood pressure cuff on them. And so we measure their blood pressure. And again, when you think about situations where you might be stressed, your blood pressure will change, of course. And so all those things are fed into the computer. And nowadays, the computer actually can analyze those charts, can actually analyze those reactions and give you the computer's assessment of whether a person's telling the truth or not. And But again, I went am a little bit old school, and we read those charts and we look for certain things on there, and we mark them and we score them. But that's just the physical way that polygraph testing works. What is way more important than that is the pre-test interview that I do with the person. So when I went up to Canada for the polygraph school, I was required to memorize, I think it was like 23 pages of a pre-test, because in their school, they taught the pre-test that should be so standardized that you should just spit it out as you're saying that pre-test. So, and matter of fact, part of our testing up there was you had a written sheet of paper, and it would give you a few words, and you would have to write out the rest of the words. So in December of 1996, when I was preparing to go up there, my wife didn't see me in the first few weeks leading up to Christmas because I was studying that pretest. But the pretest is very important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was my job as a polygraph examiner to instill in the person some confidence in the test, to let them know that if they were truthful, that they were going to pass this test, but also to let them know that if there was something that they were hiding from me, that I would be able to discover it through that test. And that psychological set that you put them in, making them lean one way or another in how they're going to perform on this test, actually helps to enhance the reactions that are occurring during the test. So that psychological set is very important. One of the other main things that we do, and you got to keep in mind, when I was doing polygraph tests, we did two different kinds of tests. Number one, we did criminal tests. So a criminal investigator would call me, he would give me the details of his case, maybe send me the report. I would review it, I would see if it was a case that was likely to be, that we could help him out with a polygraph test. And then I would conduct the test. And the second kind was for pre-employment. So anybody that the state police hired back at that time, from 1996 to when I left in 2010, they were still doing it. They stopped doing it for a little while. I think they just started it back up again. But we would give polygraph tests to our applicants to make sure they weren't hiding something from us that we needed to know about their background, which would cause us to make some judgments about their suitability for hiring with the state police. So pre-employment tests and criminal tests. The criminal tests, the objective, number one, obviously, is to get to the truth. And we'll talk a little bit about the reliability of polygraph testing. But I kind of had two roles as the polygraph examiner. Number one, to let the investigator know what my assessment of the truth was, what this person was telling me. But also, number two, if there was indications that this person was lying to me, then I would shift from conducting a polygraph test into conducting an interrogation. My job was hopefully to get a confession out of this person, obviously to solve the crime and have a good suspect, may hopefully keep the case from going to court, but also, in large part, sometimes to keep that case from going to court. Of all the polygraphs I did over 10 years in the criminal realm, probably close to half of those were in regards to child sexual abuse, child sexual assault. So think about that over 10 years. I sat in a small room with a lot of child molesters over those 10 years. And any time that I could get to the truth in a case and keep a kid from having to get up on a stand and talk about some horrific thing that may have occurred, that could be a really good thing. So as much as when I would get those confessions, as much as I would want to jump across the table and throttle that person, it was also much, much more important that I do my job and we get to the truth and we hopefully potentially get that person to have some consequences for what they did, but also protect the victim in those cases as much as possible. So, so that pre-test interview included talking about the case. So I have already reviewed the report. I've already reviewed any statements that they had already made to the police. I would look for discrepancies between that. I would write a lot of notes down, and then I would form questions based upon the information that they gave me that would allow me to conduct the test in the best way possible. You guys finding this at all interesting? Yeah. All right. I'm getting a few nods there, but I'm not sure if I'm, it's awesome, awesome. So question formulation, that's vitally important. I don't think I need to go too deep into that, but you've got to create a question. You've got to create questions on the test that are really pinpoint questions. You can't ask compound questions. You can't ask questions that they might have a doubt in their mind about what you're saying. So you spend a lot of time in that. So when I ran a polygraph test, probably the minimum for the entire test, minimum, was probably about 3 hours, 2.5 to, if I got a test done in 2.5 hours, that was amazing. Usually about 3 hours, but at least an hour and a half of that was going to be in that pre-test interview, where again, I'm instilling I'm explaining the instrument to them, I'm explaining to them what we're going to do, I'm instilling confidence in them, I'm talking about the case, I'm formulating questions. That all takes time, and we get to that point where I can finally hook that person up. I'll also say this. There were quite a bit more than a few times where somewhere in that pre-test interview, I'd already formed a conclusion about this person, and I knew, based on what they were telling me, maybe some admissions, maybe some body language, maybe some way that they were phrasing their answers, that we weren't going to do a polygraph test. We were kind of going to go into an interrogation even before I conducted the test. And the investigators that I worked for knew how I worked, and they knew that that might happen. And so we would go into an interrogation. So, but I can also tell you this. I worked with many good investigators. And not just in the state police, we conducted tests for local police departments too. A lot of them I worked for in Washington County and Fayette County over the years. Got to know a lot of defense attorneys who oftentimes knew how I operated and would actually recommend that to the investigator that their client take a polygraph test because number one, they trusted me, but number two, they knew that if their guy didn't do it, then we would find that out too, and oftentimes they wanted to know as much as the police did, whether or not they were defending an innocent person or not, or whether they were looking at maybe getting a plea bargain. So, again, it's been a long time since I've done these. I quit doing polygraph testing in 2006, so what is that, 16 years? You got a question for me?
Yeah. Wouldn't that greatly enhance the defense attorney's case in a courtroom?
Without question. So one of the questions that I would ask, and that's about where I was going to get to, when an investigator would call me and explain their case to me, oftentimes one of my first questions would be, and they would tell me, this is the guy. This is the guy. I need you to get a confession out of this guy. And when I would hear that, my first question to them back would be, what if the guy passes the polygraph test? What if it's my opinion and based on my interview and based on the polygraph test that this guy didn't commit the crime? And oftentimes it was the first time they had thought about that. They thought, hey, I got the guy, I'm locked in, this is the guy. And so they had to think about that. So when I would give that information back to the detective, back to the investigator, it was up to them what they were going to do with the case. Maybe it was a big investigation. It was really early on. They're focusing on this person, and that person passes the polygraph test. Well, that still benefits their case because that allows them to broaden where they're looking and look maybe at somebody else and direct their investigation a different way. So I would find when you say what would the defense attorney think about that. So in Pennsylvania, my opinion of the results of a polygraph test are not admissible in court. They are not. So it is a tool. It is strictly a tool for the investigators to move their investigation along. And again, oftentimes we would get to that point where we would get a confession and it really helped the cases. Could not. He could call me as a witness in regards to what we talked about in the interview room, in the polygraph room, but we could not talk about the results of the test. In some cases, judges would allow me to give my opinion of that interview and where that went, but I could not talk about the results of the polygraph test. It is state to state. So in Pennsylvania, it's not admissible. There are some states, and I've been out of the field for a long time, but at the time I do remember that there were a few, including one that comes to mind is New Mexico. But the stipulation in New Mexico was that in order for it to be admissible in court, the defense and the prosecution had to agree before the test that the results of the test were going to be admissible in court. So that, and the reason that it's not admissible, and I'll say this, the way polygraph tests are conducted vary pretty greatly from examiner to examiner. Everybody runs their test a different way. People often ask me about what's the reliability. How accurate is it, right? It's as reliable as the person given the polygraph test. Because if you don't, number one, if you don't conduct a really solid pre-test and all the other things leading up to this, you could have a flawed polygraph test. But also some of the things that you're hearing me talk about coming in with an open mind and saying, hey, if the guy passes, he passes. And I don't know, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I don't know that every polygraph examiner approaches it in the same way as I did. So the reason that it is not admissible is there is a broad range of reliability in that test based largely on how the examiner conducts his test. Fingerprints are admissible because the reliability of that is super solid. DNA stuff, although it's highly technical, they can tell you to 1 in a billion or 1 in 10 billion or whatever the case may be that this is the person. Because there is so much subjectivity in a polygraph test, you cannot narrow it down to that level of accuracy. And that's why they don't make it admissible, because they are concerned that a jury might place too much emphasis on the results of that polygraph test.
So I'm thinking of waterboarding, okay?
Yeah.
Now, that's more for investigative rather than finding out truth or falsity. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I'm no expert on waterboarding. But back when the nation was debating those kind of things, where that stuff came to light and then subsequently it was being talked about, the concern there is that somebody is going to tell you whatever they think you want to hear just to stop this process. Polygraph test is 100% voluntary, and I tell people that, and they sign a waiver when they come in, and part of that waiver is if at any time you want to stop this process or leave, you have the right to do that. So it's 100% voluntary, and nobody can be forced to take a polygraph test. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
Tony, are you recording your interaction with the person taking the polygraph test from beginning to end?
you talking about audio visual?
Yeah.
Like towards the end of my career, we started doing that, and we were a little bit behind on that here actually, because when I was up in Canada, where I went through the schooling, they had polygraph suites that were completely laid out with audio and visual, so that we can watch ourselves giving, practicing our testing procedures, and it took a little bit of time for us to get caught up with that. But I think they're recording all of those now. Yeah, which is a good thing. Transparency's huge in law enforcement these days. So it's a good question. Yes, sir.
In your opinion, what would be the purpose or the thinking behind somebody that is guilty subjecting himself or herself to a polygraph?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple of answers to that question. One is they think they can beat you. And that's one of the reasons why they might do it. Another reason is they might feel like they're boxed into a corner to the point where if they say, I don't want to take a polygraph test, then the investigator is going to say, well, then I'm going to run with what I got, and you're going to get arrested anyway. So I think those are the two main reasons why somebody might come into that room knowing that they had committed this crime. And let me say this, other than a homicide, I can think of no other thing that could be worse to be falsely accused of. And I took that to heart every time I conducted one of those tests, because I did not want to get it wrong if this guy was innocent. Put yourself in those shoes, right? Yes, sir.
Was there any difference between a man and a woman going through this test?
Other than where you place the that's probably a pretty good question too. Boy, I'm being recorded here, and I got to be a little bit careful. I'm gonna say, okay, I'm gonna say this, and I'm in a men's group, and please don't take this as being, I love all human beings. Women are better at deceiving than men are.
I knew it.
That's an
My
opinion.
wife revises history all the time. I knew it.
My wife remembers things that never happened.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think, you don't conduct a test any different, but maybe you approach it in a little bit different way. And I'll say this, everybody that comes into that polygraph room, everybody that I'm going to talk to is an individual, and I'm going to, as much as I am consistent in the process that I go through, the way that I interact with that person is going to be different. And when you mentioned why would somebody come in, and I said some people think they can beat you. When I had somebody come in that was super smart, he had a doctorate in this or that, and he had all this stuff. I'm no dummy either. I don't have a lot of degrees behind my name or in a lot of letters. But when that person would come in, I felt my polygraph test would work better if I kind of chopped him off at the knees a little bit with his ego. On the other side of that, if I had somebody that came in and felt intimidated by this process, my approach to that would be to make them feel comfortable and kind of prop them up a little bit to, again, that psychological set where I got to get the truthful person to feel comfortable and make sure that they believe they're going to pass this, and the opposite for the person who was lying. That was part of that process, was to get them in that mindset.
Tony, have you ever had anybody, lack of a better term, beat the polygraph? Somebody that turned out to be untruthful but yet beat the polygraph test?
I will say that I know of none, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll tell you the truth. There are 3 possible results with a polygraph test, and I apologize for not bringing this up before. One is non-deceptive. This person told the truth. And the scoring of those charts determines which of these 3 categories you fall in. So one is non-deceptive. The other one is deceptive. It's clear to me that through scoring these charts that you're lying. There's also an inconclusive area. And some of those tests will come out inconclusive, and that's what I tell the investigator. They know that going in, and I tell the person that. Oftentimes a person would come out inconclusive, but I still feel like based on the interview and other things that came up that I might go into a little bit of a softer interrogation with that person and see where that goes. So because you've got that opportunity to have inconclusive results, you tend not to get a lot of false negatives or false positives.
How does the examiners psychologically deal with dealing with child abusers?
How do we psychologically deal with the abuser?
Yeah, dealing with them all the time. How do you...
You mean for my psychological health?
How do you cope with it?
I think you just got to be wired a certain way, man, to know that the work that you're doing is so valuable that you are able to keep your own sanity. And I got to tell you this too, having a good home life is good for that. I never brought my work home, but when I came home, I left my work at work, and I didn't allow it to affect me. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I get it. Somebody just asked me recently if I'd ever think about getting back into that, and I said, in the realm of post-conviction testing of child sexual or sexual abusers, child molesters. And my answer to that was, I did this for 10 years. I really don't. I've had my fill, to be honest with you. That was about it for me.
Oh, I don't care.
Yes, sir.
Were sociopaths more difficult to read?
Yeah, sociopaths. So there are things that I ask. There are things that I ask in the pretest that might make me say that you are unsuitable for a polygraph test. And so there's the old saw that if you believe it, it's not a lie. Well, if there's somebody that comes in, and there's some truth to that, because if you really and truly believe that something that had occurred did not occur, then you're going to pass the polygraph test. But I'm hoping to find that quirk in your psychology somewhere in that pretest. Yeah, because remember, it's the threat of being discovered that causes you to react. And if that threat doesn't exist because you're a little whacked out upstairs, then you might not react. Yeah.
You got a good story for us?
Yeah, I know you had brought that up on the phone.
I'm trying not to put you on the spot.
No, I got to tell you, a lot of these run together, to be honest with you. And I certainly wouldn't bring up any of the... My polygraph testing was responsible for more than a handful of murder cases being solved. And a couple of the ones that come to mind, we had tested there was an old case. The case was about 20-some, maybe 30 years old. And it was a woman who was suspected of drowning her child. And because of the way law enforcement was done a long time ago, that case should have been solved very early on, but they did not apply the massive resources to that case in the first 48 hours that they should have. And so 25 or 30 years later, I'm sitting with this woman and giving her a polygraph test, and she ends up making some admissions to me about starting with where she was, starting with how she found the body, that tipped me to say, hey, this is going into an interrogation. And again, we got enough admissions for them to charge her, and she ended up pleading to that case. I think it was 25 or 30 years old. Yes.
Tony, I have quite a bit of experience on the civil side of looking at witnesses. Do you get a person and start to talk to them, and you immediately start forming opinions of how that person is going to perform in the test?
I think as a human being, you can't help but do that, especially with the training that I got. They say that 90% of communication is nonverbal. So you're watching the way this person sits, you're watching the way they turn their body, you're watching their eyes and their mouth and their facial features as you're discussing things with them. And you are listening to, you're paying attention to the pause between the question and their answer. And so you can't help but start to do that.
Yeah.
But you still have to rely on the results of the polygraph test for the official.
The reason I asked that question, it's amazing of how well a person can come over in front of an independent juror and whether or not they're believable. I'll give you a perfect example. I had a rule whenever I worked that the defense lawyer that we hired was never to call me the night before the trial begging for more money so he didn't have to go try this case. Because what they would do is bypass the clean people that I had working for me.
Yeah.
So one night, it's a Sunday night, and the lawyer was a very, very good friend of mine, and I believe anything he tells me. He calls me up. We were definitely going to go to trial with this case. He met this client for the first time on the turnpike in one of the Howard Johnsons. And what we'd normally do is tell him the trial is going to be on Wednesday. Here's a card. Go down to Kaufman's at that time and get a suit. The guy will give you a suit, and you shave and you get a haircut or whatever. This guy said, there's nobody going to tell me how the hell to cut my hair. He's doing that number with the lawyer. And I said to him, Steve, he said, I'm telling you, this guy will turn a jury off. We didn't owe one dime on this case. I said, what's the guy look like? He's got hair halfway down his back. He's wearing a hat with a big feather going down the back and got a cape. He said he looks like Dracula. He said, if I put this guy on a stand, we're going to lose. We didn't owe a dime on this case, and I told the lawyer, go ahead, pay him the $50,000 and close the case. There's no jury in the world that would ever give it and not believe this guy was guilty.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the way it came off.
Yeah.
And you know, when I first took that job, I did a test, and here's the test that I did. I dealt with about 160 lawyers. And I sent out a questionnaire. I said, no specific case, but what's the most and least important thing? And the plaintiff as a witness is the key. If you have a good plaintiff that's honest, projects a nice image, doesn't intimidate people, it's going to be tough to get a jury not to give them money. Juries do not give money to people that they don't like, period. And so I'm sure that some of that comes through. I could read the deposition and know one of the cases that happened with me personally. My best friend was an orthopedic surgeon. He was taking care of a client from Malaquippa. You would know, I will say the name. She kept telling, a female, she kept telling the doctor that her hip was jumping out of joint. And I'm thinking to myself, I never heard of an injury like that. So we put a detective on her. Guess what she was doing? She was going down to Smithton in one of those girly shows, climbing a pole. So the detective that we hired, what he did is he got a briefcase. He had a movie camera inside the briefcase. He'd go in and sit there and film her through the whole thing. So when the orthopedic surgeon got on his stand, we said, well, you think that her hip's jumping out of place because of this auto accident. What do you think about her doing this? And showed him the film. Needless to say, she wasn't a patient of his anymore. But,
Hey, Mark, here's the guy you need for the war stories.
I have a quick
Yes.
question for you. Okay,
Yes.
you said you can't use a polygraph test in court of law, right?
Yes.
Well, how about if you're innocent? That won't work either. That's what I was.
Yeah.
That was my
And that's why
point.
they had the stipulation in New Mexico that I was aware of. Both sides got to stipulate at the very beginning prior to the test, and then it could be admitted, whatever the results may be.
But
They're not going to give one side an advantage over the other.
Well, even if he admits that, okay, now I'm guilty. All right.
Yeah.
You could you use that?
Well, the confession, absolutely.
Oh, confession is.
Oh, yeah. I'm just talking about the results of the polygraph test.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So the thrust of the polygraph is really try to elicit some kind of admission.
It's a tool.
As a tool to admit, since it can't be brought in front of a judge and jury that, hey, didn't pass the polygraph test,
That's right.
therefore he's guilty.
That's right.
It's the tool that you use to try and elicit some kind of a confession.
Correct. Or direct the investigation.
Yeah.
Right.
Little bits and pieces that an investigator may now
Absolutely.
run down that path.
Absolutely. You know, oftentimes, because this person was the primary suspect, they had gotten a lawyer before they were ever able to be interviewed, and getting me to talk to them prior to the polygraph test was actually the first time we could get something down on paper as far as an interview.
Is there a lawyer present when you do a polygraph? It's just
Nope.
one-on-one?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yes, sir.
These polygraphs are more important than the objective.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd exactly put it that way, but again, it's an investigative tool, and sometimes that tool can lead to information that changes the direction of the investigation. Sometimes it's able to pinpoint the perpetrator, and sometimes it's able to elicit, I'm able to elicit a confession from that perpetrator. So there can be a lot of different results there, but I guess in general, what you're saying is correct. Yes, sir.
You said that your full examination takes about 3 hours average. I think after about 3 hours, I'd be pretty damn nervous myself.
No, listen, it's a great point or question, but for the innocent person, they're ready. For the person who's coming in there to tell the truth, they're ready to go. We get to that 3-hour mark and we're buddies. We're buddies, and they're, I'm the guy that's going to get them off the hook. For the guilty party, I had a guy who was suspected of committing a bunch of arsons down in Fayette County, and we had gone through this whole process, and I was getting ready to start hooking him up, and I could see his nervousness building to the point where he grabbed the garbage can and puked in it and said, "I'm not taking this test."
Game over.
Game over. Yeah.
Yeah, but where does it go?
That's right.
Where does it go from there? You can't submit the polygraph results in court. So do you go back to the investigators and say, this is what the guy showed me and this is what he did?
Yeah.
And then do they hone in on more specific issues associated with this guy? And
They can. That often happens, yeah. So if I conclude my polygraph test, and oftentimes we did this in a room where the investigator is on the other side of two-way glass and can hear what's going on, watching what's going on. And so when I concluded the polygraph test, I would take that laptop and move it aside. And if the person passed the test, I would tell them. But if they failed the test, then my next kind of line to them was, listen, you came in here, had an open mind. We were hoping you were going to pass this polygraph test, but you didn't. And so now, rather than asking if you did this, which I know you did, the question is why. And then the interrogation wasn't like a rubber hose, bright light kind of thing. It was developing themes to give this guy pathways to tell us what he did by explaining that he's not a horrible demon. He's just a guy who was in a bad situation or was tempted by something or thought it was involved in something that went too far. You develop these themes with the person to try to get them to move a little bit closer to the truth, and that's where you get the confession. Listen. I used to use this line. And now there's a show on TV about a series about it. I used to tell these guys, listen, you're not Jeffrey Dahmer. You're a guy who had a little bit too much to drink and was put in a situation where you were tempted to do something that you normally wouldn't do, and you made a mistake. And if you could go back to that point in time, you'd have changed some things. You wouldn't have done it. And so now when this case goes to court, prosecution is going to make you look like Jeffrey Dahmer. Well, this is your chance to tell your side of the story. Well, I love that stuff, man. I do, and it's coming back to me now. But the idea was, and we would give them mothering statements. If you didn't do this, I don't want you to say something that didn't happen, because I don't want a false confession. I want the truth. And so you would find you would hit them with one thing, hit them with another thing, hit them with another thing, and maybe somewhere along the line they say that something clicks up there, and they start opening up to you.
Mm-hmm. In your notes, do you put opinion of certain things that investigators use, or is it strictly sanitized this, and this?
Absolutely.
You have an opinion that the investigator will take into consideration. Your best.
They got to trust me pretty much. Yeah,
That's
I
why
would
imagine
call.
that. You know, interesting.
I'm sorry.
Did you ever have a case where you, in your heart of hearts, were absolutely convinced that the person was innocent, yet they were convicted? Did that ever happen?
Or not? Do you mean convicted, or do you mean they failed the polygraph test? I'll say again, there none specifically come to mind, but there were some that you were leaning hard in that direction, that they didn't do this, and then you would see these reactions. And frankly, I would report that, put that in my report to the investigator, and tell him, listen, you can take this and you can run with it, but I think you've got some more work to do in your investigation. You know, I had to live with myself, you know. Yeah.
I got a question. 33 years ago, I was in a 12-step group, and there was a lawyer in the group with his wife. She had the ability to read somebody. Now, I don't know how much training she took, but she took quite a bit. And it came time to give our, stories, scenarios of our life, And after all of us spoke, she came over to me and she says, I hope you have a better year next year. But she told the other people, he says, you're going to have to try and come up with a better story, you know. But she didn't use no machine enough. She just sat there, listened, and watched behavior from head to toe, and came about an answer.
And so that's a great point. So you think about it, people who have been through substance abuse issues maybe have experienced a lot of things in their life. And those life experiences cause you to become good at that stuff, especially if you're put in situations where you have to judge somebody's veracity. You have to judge whether or not this person's telling you the truth. You have to judge whether or not you're going to be safe with this person. So those life experiences bring you to that level where you get very good at that, right?
Anybody else got a?
What capabilities would you have to be able to fool a polygraph? And for instance, would you be able to coach somebody into?
So you got something coming up? Is there?
I'd appreciate some counseling. Yeah.
Some we should know about.
So polygraph testing, including the instrument itself and the ways that that it's being used, is continuing to progress. So now they have a pad that they put on the floor that allows them to see if people are shifting their body weight or moving. There are some people that think that taking medication will beat the system, kind of dull their reactions. Well, those people that do that, that's able to be seen on the charts. It's pretty simple. And we ask that. We screen for that. And those people also will have a certain demeanor. The short answer is no. That being said, because I've done it for 10 years, I don't think I could coach you, but I think I might be able to kind of put myself in a situation. Again, these are physiological reactions that you can't control. You know, can you stop your fingertips from sweating? Can you stop your blood pressure? Maybe with some breathing, but if you're changing your breathing, I'm going to see anomalies on the chart too. I'm not going to say 100% no to that question, but I'm going to say, man, that's tough.
So you better confess.
But that's a good question. That's one of the questions that I get a lot, really. Yeah. Or used to.
Anybody else? Could you, kind of to wrap this thing up, and approaching 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
What's going on in Beaver County now? I mean, in the news lately is all the fentanyl and stuff that's coming across the southern border and opioid addictions and so forth. Are you seeing a lot of that in Beaver County, or?
Yeah, it has ticked up. So I took office in 2016. And in Beaver County, and actually all across Pennsylvania and the country, that was a point in time when fentanyl was starting to be seen and starting to grow. And we had some really high numbers of overdoses and overdose deaths in 16 and 17, and then it seemed to drop off a little bit for a couple of years. And I don't know if the isolation that was caused by our reaction to COVID started ticking it back up. I suspect that may be the case. I know that the availability of fentanyl, which is super deadly, has gone through the roof. I had a chance last year to go out to the eastern part of PA to a senior law enforcement leadership conference, and one of the speakers there was Tom Homan. Tom was the former director of ICE, and he spoke about it. And these massive numbers of people coming across the border. And keep in mind, Tom, because of the position that he was in, still has a lot of contacts in border protection, down to the ground level. And what he was telling me is that these cartels that are bringing these people across the border are but check this out. They're no dummies. These guys are making hundreds of millions of dollars doing this. And I can't remember the figures that he told me, but it's something around the area of, for every one of these people that they bring across, they're getting about $4,000 for these people they're bringing across. But they get a lot more than that for bringing across drugs and drug dealers and potentially terrorists. So what they do is they flood the zone. They bring a bunch of these people, they're common people trying to get to America, and they bring them across at a certain time. And that causes border protection to take all of their assets for 30 miles this way and 30 miles this way and bring them all to these processing centers. And they're tied up there processing these people. And as a result of that, the borders are wide open. And that's where they're making the big money, $30,000 bringing these people across, bringing the drugs across, making, again, hundreds of millions of dollars doing this. So as much as we think, okay, that's Texas and Arizona, and that's not our issue, the deaths that have gone back up through the roof again as a result of this. And I know back in 16 and 17, I would talk to people like this, and I'd say, who here has been affected by an overdose by a friend, a family member, a neighbor, somebody that you know, a child of a friend? And half the room would raise their hand. We're getting back to that level again, and we got to stop this. Yeah. It's just become too easy and too cheap, and it's really affecting the younger people now too, because that first jump, that first rise in these numbers was late 20s to 40s, and now we're seeing the numbers come down to where it's kids. They think they're doing one type of drug, and they're actually getting fentanyl in their system. So, yeah, it's bad.
Do people know, do the drug users know that they're buying fentanyl, or because it is so deadly, or is it shielded to them?
Both.
Both.
Yeah. So it is highly addictive. And some people will say, well, why would you give it to somebody if you're killing your customer? Well, maybe you're not killing them the first time. And maybe you're building a customer. Maybe you're turning a person into a long-term customer. And so they're not stupid. They're not going to kill their people if they can make money off of them. They're trying to make people into addicts.
Well, I want to thank you very much. You were worried about filling an hour, and we've gone over now, so that was very enlightening. Thank you, Sheriff.
Hey, can I say one thing more? Can I say one thing more? And I told myself I was going to do this from a certain point on. So earlier this year, first let me say this. I'm 61 years old. I was never one of those guys that would always go to the doctor and have a yearly checkup and all that kind of stuff. Earlier this year, I was trying to get raise my life insurance, and got a test back, showed high PSA. And about 2 months ago, I had my prostate removed and still dealing with some treatments after that. Most of you guys are older than me, I think. I don't want to, I hope I'm not insulting anybody, but I think most of you guys are older than me. Maybe you're past beyond that thing. But don't be a tough guy like I thought I was. Go and get an exam and a blood test at least once a year if you're in that age group or if you're high risk, because you don't want to have to deal with those kind of things. And I told myself I was going to be the guy that was going to beat that drum every chance I got. So
spit nails and build a battleship, huh? Thank you very much.